They said I was nothing, but I was about to prove them wrong. The grand ballroom of Ashvale Manor shimmered with golden chandeliers, casting a soft glow over the polished marble floor. The air was thick with perfume and whispered conversations, yet there was an undeniable tension hanging in the atmosphere. Sophia stood at the far corner of the room, her simple dress of faded lavender clinging to her form like a shadow in the midst of extravagance. Her hands were folded delicately in front of her, a small frayed handkerchief clenched in her fingers. Her gaze drifted over the opulence surrounding her, the laughter of the aristocrats, the graceful movements of noble women in satin gowns, and the way their eyes fluttered with practiced elegance. She was nothing like them. She wasn't even supposed to be here. She had been brought in as an afterthought, a cousin to the family's wealth, a mere servant in their eyes. Yet here she was, alone in a sea of beautiful, well-connected women, waiting for something she knew would never come, a chance at being noticed. But all of that was about to change. The doors opened, and the room fell silent. The Duke had arrived. Dorian Reinhardt, Duke of Ashfield, the man whose very presence could bend the will of the nobility, strode into the ballroom. His dark coat flowed behind him like a shadow, the gold of his cuffs catching the light. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room as he moved, ignoring the hasty curtsies, the fluttering of fans, and the way the other women tried to catch his eye. He wasn't looking for them. His gaze was unwavering, as if he were searching for something, or someone, specific. Every footstep he took sent ripples through the crowd, a quiet storm that everyone could feel, but none dared to acknowledge. Sophia's breath caught in her throat when their eyes met. She couldn't explain why, but in that instant, everything felt different. The noise of the room seemed to fade, the chatter of the aristocrats growing muffled. Time itself seemed to stretch, holding its breath as Dorian Reinhardt's gaze locked onto hers. He didn't speak, but the weight of his stare was enough to make her heart race. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though he could see straight through the facade she had spent years perfecting. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment passed. Dorian continued walking, his focus shifting back to the line of eligible women, his gaze cold and dismissive. Sophia's heart hammered in her chest as the world returned to its chaotic rhythm. She tried to breathe normally, to steady herself, but her hands betrayed her. The handkerchief, now crumpled in her fingers, slipped to the floor. She bent down to pick it up, her movements slow and careful, praying no one had noticed. But then his voice. Dorian said, his voice calm and certain, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Everyone turned toward him, and all eyes followed the direction of his gaze. They fell on her. Her, he repeated, his voice a low command that sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, there was only silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to break. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Had he just chosen her? The other women shifted uncomfortably, their expressions flickering between disbelief and disdain. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the sudden judgment in their eyes. But what did it matter? He had chosen her. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the ground beneath her feet uncertain. Every fiber of her being screamed that this wasn't right, that she didn't belong, that she would be sent away any moment. Yet there she stood, under the Duke's gaze, feeling something she had never felt before, seen. And the realization hit her like a tidal wave. This was only the beginning. The silence in the room was deafening. Sophia stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of every gaze in the ballroom pressing against her. She could feel the eyes of the other women burning into her skin, the disbelief and anger radiating from them. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at the Duke, whose expression remained unreadable, his gaze piercing and unwavering. He had chosen her, but why? She was no one. She had never been anyone. Yet here she was, the center of attention, as the others stood still, waiting for some kind of explanation. But there was none. Dorian Reinhardt didn't need to explain himself. He was the Duke. His word was law. And the moment he had spoken her name, everything had shifted. The world around her seemed to blur, the chatter of the room muffled by the roar in her ears. She tried to steady her breathing, her hands trembling as she clutched the handkerchief she had dropped earlier, now wrinkled and crumpled in her palm. She had never been a part of this world. She had always existed on the fringes, overlooked and ignored. But now, in front of everyone, the Duke had chosen her. Chosen her over the women with their golden gowns, their perfect figures, their impeccable pedigrees. And as the seconds ticked by, the reality of it all began to settle in. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. Dorian moved toward her, his steps deliberate, each one echoing through the room. He was coming closer, closer than she had ever imagined. And with each step, the space between them seemed to shrink, the tension between them thickening like a storm cloud, ready to burst. He stopped just a few feet away, his presence so commanding that she felt the air grow heavier around her. Sophia's breath hitched as he looked down at her, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if he were assessing her every move, every breath. She stood taller now, though still not a match for his towering presence. His eyes flicked briefly to her hands, which still clenched the handkerchief, before slowly returning to her face. "Come with me," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but every syllable carried weight, authority. The command hung in the air, unmistakable. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't. With a single motion, she moved toward him, feeling the eyes of the room follow her every step. Her heart raced, but there was no turning back. She was about to walk into the unknown. As she crossed the room, the whispers of the crowd seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of her own footsteps and the heavy thud of her pulse in her ears. She could hear the other women muttering behind her, their voices full of venom, full of disbelief. But Sophia didn't care. The Duke had chosen her, and nothing else mattered. Dorian turned sharply, his coat swirling around him like the wind as he made his way toward the doors at the far end of the ballroom. Sophia followed closely behind, trying to steady her breath, her heart still racing in her chest. She had never been this close to him before. Never had she been so near to someone with such power, such command. She had always felt small, insignificant, in the presence of people like him. But now, she was walking beside him. She could feel the heat of his body, the intensity of his presence, and for a moment, she wondered if she was truly worthy of his attention. As they reached the door, Dorian turned to her, his eyes locking with hers. "Stay close," he said, his voice cold but not unkind. "You're not here for the show. You're here because I chose you." The finality of his words sent a shock through her system. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight. He hadn't given her a choice. And as the doors opened before them, the ballroom's noise seemed to fade, leaving only the promise of what was to come. Sophia stepped into the unknown, her mind swirling with uncertainty, her heart full of a hope she couldn't quite understand. All she knew was this: she was chosen, and that was enough for now. The heavy doors of the ballroom closed behind them, sealing off the noise and chaos of the grand event. Sophia's pulse raced, her heart still echoing the beat of her steps across the marble floor. She was alone with him now, the Duke, the man whose choice had altered everything in a single word. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, filled with a tension that crackled like static in the air. Dorian Reinhardt's presence loomed over her, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the flickering light of the hall. His every movement was deliberate, as if the very act of walking was a statement of power. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, piercing through her, searching for something she wasn't sure she could give. Sophia stood there, unsure, her hands trembling at her sides. She had been chosen, but she had no idea why. She had no idea what was expected of her, or what he expected from her. "Come," Dorian said suddenly, his voice low, smooth, and commanding, as he turned sharply on his heel and began walking toward the long corridor that stretched ahead. The sound of his boots clicking against the stone floor echoed through the quiet, and she followed him instinctively, her feet moving before her mind could catch up. As they walked, the tension between them grew thicker. She could feel his presence pressing down on her, making her feel small, insignificant. His every step was measured, controlled, while hers were uncertain, almost hesitant. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the sound of it filling the space between them, louder with each passing second. She wanted to ask him why he had chosen her, what had made her different from the others, but the words caught in her throat. She was afraid of what his answer might be, afraid of the possibility that she was nothing more than a fleeting curiosity to him, a momentary distraction. They reached the end of the corridor, and Dorian stopped. He didn't turn to face her, but she knew he was aware of her standing just behind him. She could feel the heat of his body, the unspoken power in the space between them. "You will stay here," he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge to it that sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know what that meant. Stay where? Why? But she didn't dare speak. He didn't need to explain. He was the Duke. His word was law. "I don't understand," she said quietly, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. The moment they left her mouth, she regretted them, but it was too late. Dorian turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they met hers. His gaze was cold, calculating, and for a brief moment, Sophia wondered if she had made a mistake. "You don't have to understand," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not yet." She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. The power dynamic had shifted again. She was no longer just an unnoticed noblewoman in a sea of perfect women. Now, she was at the center of his world, and she had no idea how to navigate it. Dorian took another step toward her, closing the distance between them with a single fluid movement. His presence surrounded her, overwhelming her senses. "You are here because I chose you," he said, his words like a promise, or perhaps a warning. "Not because you are the most beautiful or the most accomplished, but because I saw something in you." He didn't elaborate, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, counting the seconds that felt like an eternity. Sophia's chest tightened, her heart racing faster. She had no idea what he meant, but she didn't dare ask. His silence spoke volumes, and the weight of it settled over her, making her feel both exposed and trapped. She wanted to run, to escape the intensity of his gaze, but her body wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, caught in his web. Slowly, Dorian reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm in a gesture so small, so fleeting, that it might have been imagined. But it wasn't. His touch sent a jolt through her system, a spark of electricity that left her breathless. She could feel the tension between them building, like the moment before a storm breaks. The space between them was filled with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings. "You will learn your place," Dorian said, his voice a low murmur, barely audible, but somehow more commanding than ever. "In time." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Sophia standing in the silence, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. What had just happened? What was he asking of her? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. Her life had just changed forever. The Duke had chosen her, but the real question was, why? The silence that had followed Dorian's words weighed heavily on the room. Sophia stood alone, her heart thudding in her chest, feeling the collective gaze of the ballroom on her back. The Duke had spoken, his words hung in the air, still vibrating with authority, but now, everything felt as if it had tilted on its axis. The power dynamic had shifted. She could feel it. The air had changed, thickened, and it wasn't just her who noticed. Every woman in the room seemed to take a collective breath, their eyes flicking between Sophia and the Duke. But none dared speak. Dorian Reinhardt was no ordinary man. He was a Duke, one whose every word carried the weight of centuries of aristocracy. And Sophia, for all her humble beginnings, was now at the center of his world. As the murmur of the crowd began to pick up again, the tension in the room escalated. Whispers spread like wildfire, their sharp edges cutting through the previously serene atmosphere. "What is he thinking?" someone muttered. "He chose her," came another voice, disbelieving and full of venom. Sophia's fingers tightened around the hem of her dress, her palms slick with sweat. She had never felt more exposed in her life. She was used to being invisible, a shadow in the corners, unnoticed. But now, she was at the epicenter of something far greater than she could understand. The weight of the Duke's gaze felt like a physical presence, pressing against her skin, making it difficult to breathe. And then, without a word, Dorian turned his back to her. She couldn't stop herself from glancing at the others in the room. The noble women who had once dismissed her, the women whose lives had been planned for them, whose futures were laid out like neatly folded linens. They were all staring at her now, their faces a mixture of shock, jealousy, and disdain. It was almost as if they were trying to make her shrink, to make her disappear again. But something inside her stirred. She stood a little taller, her chin lifting just slightly. For the first time in her life, She felt the tiniest flicker of something, a spark of power, perhaps, or the beginning of one. She wasn't sure, but she wasn't about to let herself be crushed by their gazes. Not anymore. Dorian turned back to her, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. He didn't need to speak for her to understand that he was waiting for something. But what? He raised a single brow, and without thinking, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her heart was racing, her hands still trembling. "You will walk with me," he said, his voice low but unmistakable. Now, it was not a request. It was a command. The room seemed to fall silent again as the Duke began, walking toward the grand staircase, his long strides echoing through the marble hall. Sophia moved to follow, her feet heavy, uncertain. The weight of the crowd's gaze bore down on her, but she couldn't stop herself from stepping forward. Her body felt as though it were being pulled toward him by some invisible force. She had never been this close to him before, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. As they reached the top of the staircase, Sophia caught a glimpse of the ballroom below. The faces of the guests seemed like a blur, their eyes on her, the whispers loud in her ears. She wanted to look away, to pretend none of this was happening, but she couldn't. Dorian reached the balcony and stopped. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked, his voice cold but not unkind. Sophia hesitated, her throat tight. "No," she whispered. "Then you will learn," Dorian replied. He was so close now, his presence overwhelming, but there was something in his eyes that made her stay still. The tension between them was palpable, the power shift undeniable. He was the Duke, and she was nothing. But for some reason, he had chosen her. "You will stay here," he said again, his voice firm, like the finality of a decree. "And when I call for you, you will come." She nodded, unable to speak. Her chest tightened. She had no idea what he meant, what was expected of her, but there was a part of her that wanted to know. There was a part of her that wanted to step into the world he had opened for her, no matter how terrifying it seemed. The room behind her seemed distant now, the sounds of the crowd fading. It was just the two of them now. But even as she stood there, with the weight of his words still ringing in her ears, Sophia felt something stir inside her. This was only the beginning. She had been chosen, and she didn't know what it meant yet, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same. The Duke had made his decision. And now, so would she. The sound of footsteps echoed down the long, darkened hallway as Dorian led Sophia deeper into the heart of the mansion. The grand staircase they had just ascended was now far behind them, replaced by the cool, polished floors of the inner corridor, a place few had seen, reserved only for the highest of the high, the most powerful. His presence filled the space around them, oppressive, like a storm waiting to break. Sophia's heart raced in her chest, the pressure mounting with each step. The room ahead was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. "Follow me," Dorian said, his voice low, but firm, pulling her from her thoughts. She nodded, her feet moving before her mind could catch up, her pulse pounding in her ears. As they entered the room, the flicker of candlelight bounced off the walls, illuminating the stark contrasts between the gilded opulence and the sharp shadows cast by the tall windows. Sophia felt as if she were walking through a dream, a vision of grandeur that had once seemed so far out of her reach. But now she was here. She was here because of him. The Duke. The weight of her circumstances pressed down on her shoulders like 1,000 pounds, but she refused to shrink. Not now. Not when the eyes of the entire world were on her. Dorian didn't look at her as he walked to the large window at the far end of the room, his back to her. The power in his posture was unmistakable, the ease with which he held himself a reminder of the world he ruled. Sophia swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. Her hands were clammy, her thoughts a tangled mess. She wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. And so, she stood there, her silence both her strength and her weakness. "You've been chosen," Dorian said, his voice almost too soft, but she heard every word as if they were a thunderclap. She flinched, the words striking her like a physical blow. She had been chosen. But for what? To stand beside him? To be a pawn in his game of power? She didn't know. But what she did know was that the world outside this room was watching, judging, waiting for her to falter. And that was something she could not afford to do. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Dorian turned to face her then, his eyes locking onto hers, his gaze sharp, unreadable. He studied her. For a moment, as though assessing something deep inside her, something that was hidden, buried beneath the surface. "Do you think you're ready?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. She froze. His question was a challenge, an invitation to prove herself. Sophia wasn't sure what it meant, but she knew one thing. He wasn't asking for her answer. He was demanding her strength. She began, but the words died on her lips as Dorian took a step closer, his tall figure looming over her, his presence overwhelming. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his nearness was enough. She could feel the heat of his body, the sheer force of his will, and it shook her to her core. "You are not here by accident," he said, his words deliberate, each one calculated to drive home the truth. "You are here because I see something in you, something no one else does, and I will not allow you to waste this chance." His gaze never wavered, never softened. The power between them was palpable, like a force that could level mountains. And yet, Sophia stood there, barely able to breathe, her hands still shaking by her sides. She had never been in a situation like this before. Never had she been thrust into the center of a storm so fierce, so unforgiving. The walls around her seemed to close in, the silence between them growing deafening. "I won't waste it," she said finally, her voice quieter than she had intended, but steady. The words were true, even if she wasn't sure what they meant. "Good," Dorian replied, his voice a low murmur, full of approval but also something darker. He took a step back then, his eyes never leaving hers. For a brief moment, the tension in the room shifted, the power dynamic between them tilting ever so slightly. Sophia could feel it, the shift in the air, the change in the way he looked at her. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was a player in his world now, whether she was ready or not. He turned away, his attention once again drawn to the window, his back to her. "You have a role to play," he said, his voice distant now, but the weight of his words still clung to her like a heavy cloak. "And you will play it well." The finality in his voice made her breath catch. She had no choice but to accept this, to step into the life he was offering her. But she didn't know what that life would entail. She didn't know how far the power of the Duke would stretch, or how deep she would be pulled into the game he was setting before her. All she knew was this: she was no longer invisible, and the consequences of that were just beginning to unfold. The room around her seemed to close in, the air thick with tension, and for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of power pressing down on her like a storm gathering on the horizon. What she didn't know was that the storm had already begun. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. Sophia could feel it as she stood there, her body frozen, every nerve in her being on high alert. Dorian had yet to look at her again, but she could feel his presence pressing down on her like a weight. The silence between them stretched out, and it was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of them in this private bubble of power and uncertainty. She was in his world now, and every move she made would matter. She could feel the eyes of the staff on her, the subtle glances that darted her way as they moved about the room, pretending to be busy. Sophia didn't know how long she had been standing there, but her legs were beginning to ache from the tension, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Dorian finally moved, his steps slow and measured as he crossed the room, the click of his boots against the stone floor echoing in the silence. He was purposeful in every action, every movement a calculated display of power. He didn't need to speak to command attention. His presence alone was enough to make the room hold its breath. Sophia's chest tightened as she watched him, her heart beating in her throat. What was he planning? What did he want from her? She had no answers, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. As he reached the large oak desk at the far end of the room, Dorian paused, his back to her. He didn't speak. For a long moment, his hands resting on the surface of the desk as he stared at the contents before him. The stillness in the room was suffocating, and yet, Sophia felt as though she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as if every part of her was waiting for the next move. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, a controlled, almost casual tone that sent a shiver down her spine. "You think you've earned a place here, don't you?" he asked, not looking at her. The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, and it stung more than she expected. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. I don't understand, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I don't understand what you want from me. Dorian turned then, his eyes locking onto hers, the intensity in his gaze overwhelming. It was like being pinned under the weight of a storm, his presence so commanding that Sophia felt as though the air had thickened around them. He took a step toward her, and her breath hitched. You don't understand because you've never been a part of this world, he said, his words slow, deliberate. You've never been forced to prove your worth the way we do. The way I do. The words were a punch to the gut, but there was no malice in his voice, just the cold, unyielding reality of his world. A world where power was everything, and she was still struggling to find her place in it. Dorian stepped even closer, closing the gap between them, and she could feel the heat of his body, the strength radiating from him. His presence overwhelmed her senses, his scent, his warmth, his power. He wasn't touching her, but she could feel every inch of him. Do you think you're special? He asked, his voice low, almost teasing, but with an edge that made it impossible for her to ignore. Do you think that because I chose you, that means you've won? That you've somehow earned your place at my side? Sophia's heart raced in her chest. This was a test, she realized. A test of her strength, of her will. He was pushing her, challenging her, and she was failing. She had no answers, no defense against his words. She was nothing more than a pawn in his game, and he knew it. But as she stood there, her mind racing, something inside her stirred. She wasn't weak. She wasn't going to shrink back into the shadows, not again. She raised her chin, meeting his gaze with a newfound resolve. No, she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. I don't think I'm special. I don't think I've won anything. But I am here, and I will not be invisible. The words left her before she could stop them, and in that moment, she realized she meant every one of them. The room seemed to hold its breath as Dorian stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. And then, slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It was brief, but it was there, and it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. Very well, he said, his voice low and full of something she couldn't quite place. He turned away from her then, his back to her once more as he moved toward the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds beyond. You'll learn, Sophia. You'll learn what it means to be chosen. And you'll learn what it means to be part of this world. The finality in his words left her no room to argue. He wasn't offering her a choice, and yet, she found herself wanting to prove him wrong, wanting to show him that she wasn't just some shadow in the background. As Dorian turned back to face her, his eyes locked onto hers once more, and this time, there was no doubt in his gaze. This was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and neither of them could avoid it. The weight of the air in the room felt as though it had thickened, each second dragging on with unbearable intensity. Sophia stood, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, trying to steady her breath, but Dorian's presence, his gaze, kept her rooted to the spot. He hadn't moved since their exchange, his sharp eyes fixed on her, assessing, measuring her every response. The silence stretched between them, unbearable, until Dorian's voice finally broke it, low and measured. You're still unsure, aren't you? The question was like a blade, cutting through the tension in the air. Sophia couldn't bring herself to answer immediately. The truth was, she was unsure. Unsure of herself, of him, of the strange new world she had been thrust into. Every instinct told her to step back, to shrink, to escape this pressure, but something else kept her planted firmly where she stood. She couldn't look away from him. She didn't want to. You'll learn, he said again, this time with a slight edge to his tone, as if he was testing her resolve. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them, his every movement so deliberate, so controlled that it was impossible to ignore the weight of his authority. Sophia's breath hitched as he stopped just inches away from her. She could feel the heat radiating off his body, the raw power in every inch of him. He was imposing, unyielding, and she was nothing but a fleeting presence in his world. I didn't choose you to be a mere decoration, Dorian continued, his voice like velvet but sharp beneath the surface. You're here to prove that you're more than what they think of you, more than what I've seen of you. The words stung, and Sophia felt the familiar sting of being an outsider, the feeling of not belonging, creeping back into her chest. He was right, though. She was nothing in his eyes. Nothing compared to the women who belonged here, who had been born into this world of power, wealth, and influence. She didn't belong here, not really. But Dorian had chosen her, and that made her want to fight, to prove that she wasn't weak, that she wasn't insignificant. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze, her eyes steady. "I will prove it," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. There was a flicker of something in Dorian's eyes, something like surprise, though it quickly vanished, replaced by his usual cold composure. "Prove it," he repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the words. He stepped back then, and for a moment, Sophia felt the loss of his presence like a physical ache. But he wasn't done yet. Dorian's eyes never left hers as he moved around her, each step slow, measured, as if he were walking in a space only he commanded. "Let's see if you have the strength to stand in this world," he said. He was behind her now, his breath almost a whisper in her ear, his voice low, deliberate. "The world that will chew you up and spit you out if you let it." Sophia's heart raced. The pressure was building, the weight of his words pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. She wasn't sure how long she could stand it, this constant push and pull, this feeling of being caught between worlds. She had always been in the shadows, waiting for a moment to step into the light. But now that she was here, standing before him, the light felt blinding, suffocating. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, a question she had been holding inside for so long. "I want you to learn what it means to have power," Dorian replied, his voice low, carrying an edge of finality. He stepped closer again, and this time, his hand brushed against hers. It was a fleeting touch, just the slightest contact, but it was enough to send a jolt through her, a spark of awareness, of something more, something she couldn't name. She froze, unable to look away, her heart thundering in her chest. "This is your chance, Sophia," Dorian continued, his voice taking on a different tone now, almost softer, though still as commanding as ever. "To step into a world where you aren't invisible, where your choices matter." He leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her ear. "But you must decide if you're willing to take it." He pulled away then, his hand brushing lightly against the back of her neck as he turned, leaving her standing there in the stillness of the room. For a moment, everything went quiet, and all Sophia could hear was the pounding of her own heart. The tension in the room had reached its peak, but it wasn't resolved. Not yet. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she couldn't back down now. She wouldn't. Dorian was waiting for her to make a choice, to show him what she was made of. And she would. She had to. She wouldn't be the woman they thought she was, the woman who couldn't stand up for herself, the one who didn't belong. No, she would rise, and she would show him that she wasn't just a shadow in his world. She was a force, and she would not be forgotten. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with determination. Dorian met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes. Something more than just power, something deeper. But it was fleeting, and the moment passed as quickly as it had come. "Prove it," he said again, his voice low and unyielding. And in that moment, Sophia knew that her journey had only just begun. The weight of the silence in the grand hall pressed down on Sophia like an invisible hand, each breath harder to take than the last. Dorian's presence was suffocating, his energy filling the space between them as he watched her with that same calculating gaze. She could feel his eyes on her, even when he wasn't looking directly at her. He didn't need to say anything. His power was in the way he moved, the way the room seemed to shrink when he stepped forward. Sophia's body stiffened in response, her every instinct screaming to retreat, but she stood still, forcing herself to endure the pressure. It was a test. He was testing her. "Come with me." Dorian's voice cut through the tension, low and unyielding. His command was like a rope thrown into the storm, pulling her along whether she was ready or not. She moved, but her feet felt heavy, her heart hammering in her chest. She had thought the hardest part was the moment he had chosen her, but she was wrong. That had been just the beginning. Now, as she walked beside him, her mind raced. What did he expect from her? Was this just another game to him? Was she truly worthy of the space she now occupied in his world? Dorian's pace was steady, calculated. He didn't rush, didn't need to. It was as if the very act of walking beside him was a privilege. Sophia couldn't look away, not from the floor, not from the door ahead, not from anything but him. He was commanding her with every step, pushing her into a world that was both exhilarating and terrifying. As they reached the long table in the center of the room, Dorian stopped and turned to face her. His gaze was sharp, slicing through her defenses with a single look. There was no kindness in his eyes, no warmth. "I don't know why I chose you," he said, his voice cool and disinterested, as if the answer didn't matter. "But you're here now, and you'll prove yourself, or you'll be discarded like the others." The words stung, cutting into her chest. She had expected them, but hearing them from him, hearing them out loud, was different. She wasn't just some woman who had been chosen for her beauty or her wit. She was a test, and she wasn't sure she could pass. "You don't get to choose me," Sophia said, her voice trembling but firm. She was shaking, but there was something rising inside her, a fire she didn't know she had. "I'm not here to be your puppet." Dorian's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in them. Was it approval? Amusement? It was impossible to tell. "Then prove it," he replied, his tone steady but with an undercurrent of challenge. He took a step closer, closing the space between them. His body was so near now that she could feel the heat of him, smell the faint trace of cologne that clung to his skin. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the air between them felt charged, as if a single spark could ignite it all. "This world isn't for the faint of heart, Sophia. It's for those who know how to survive, those who can adapt, those who can fight back when they're pushed." He leaned in slightly, his lips brushing her ear as he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you one of those?" His breath was warm against her skin, and Sophia felt a shiver run through her. She wanted to look away, to step back, but she didn't. She couldn't. The tension between them was unbearable. The way he stood so close, waiting for her answer, his power so palpable that it felt like it was suffocating her. She swallowed hard. This was it. This was the moment when she either stepped into the fire or let it burn her alive. "I will fight," she said, her voice steady now, though her heart still beat wildly in her chest. "But I will do it on my own terms." There it was. The challenge laid bare. Dorian's lips twitched into a smile, something dark and approving in his expression. He didn't speak, but for a brief second, Sophia saw something in him shift. He didn't move away, but he didn't move closer either. The space between them remained thick, with tension, unresolved, as if everything depended on the next moment. "Very well," he said, his voice smooth, like silk over steel. "You'll have your chance. But know this, every choice you make, every step you take, will be watched. If you fail, you'll fall." His words hung in the air like a verdict, and Sophia felt them sink deep into her chest. There was no escaping it now. She was in this world, a world of power and control, and there was no turning back. As Dorian stepped away, she felt the sudden emptiness of the space he had occupied, but his presence still lingered, like a storm cloud that had yet to burst. Sophia stood there, her body still trembling, her mind spinning. The walls around her felt like they were closing in, the weight of Dorian's challenge pressing down on her with every passing second. She had been chosen, yes, but now she understood something far more terrifying. The game had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about survival. It was about domination, and she had to decide if she was willing to play the game, or if she would be crushed beneath it. The air between them crackled with tension, a storm brewing in the stillness of the grand hall. Dorian stood across from her, his figure tall and imposing, his eyes cold and unreadable. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. She had been pulled into this world by his choice, but now, as he stood there, his presence suffocating, she felt a shift that felt like a breaking point. He was testing her, pushing her to her limits, and she knew that if she faltered, if she hesitated for a moment, she would lose everything. "You've been quiet," Dorian said, his voice low, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. "I expected more from you." His gaze was piercing, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. Sophia opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. There was no defense for what he had said, no way to explain the turmoil inside her. She wasn't just fighting him. She was fighting herself. The pressure, the eyes of the room, the expectations, she could feel them all closing in. "I'm not here to be your pawn," Sophia finally managed to say, her voice shaking, but strong. I am here because you chose me. But that doesn't mean I will bend to your will. She stood her ground, meeting his gaze, despite the fear coursing through her. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Dorian didn't move, didn't speak. He simply studied her, his eyes dark, calculating. For a moment, Sophia thought she had made a mistake, thought that she had crossed a line she shouldn't have. But then, without warning, Dorian stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a single stride. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as he moved so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His presence overwhelmed her, and for a brief moment, she thought she might drown in it. "You think you have a choice?" he asked, his voice so quiet, so controlled, that it sent a shiver down her spine. "You think that because I chose you, you have the luxury of choosing your own path?" He was so close now, his voice a whisper in her ear. The tension between them was at its peak, the air thick with unspoken words. She could feel his breath against her skin, his presence pressing down on her with a weight she could barely understand. She wanted to back away, to escape the storm that was building between them, but she didn't. She stood still, her body trembling, her heart racing. "I will not be your puppet," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, though her body was betraying her. Dorian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Sophia thought she had seen a flicker of something in them, something like approval. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but the weight of it lingered. "You're not a puppet," he said, his voice low, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it that made Sophia's pulse race. "But you will learn to play the game. You will learn that power doesn't come without cost." His words hung in the air, and Sophia felt the weight of them sink deep into her chest. She had been chosen, yes, but now she understood something more terrifying. Being chosen meant she would have to prove herself, again and again, in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. And the cost? The cost would be high. She had no illusions about that. But as Dorian moved away from her, his presence still lingering in the space between them, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't back down now. She couldn't let him win. Not when she had come this far. The power dynamic had shifted. She wasn't the fragile, ignored noblewoman she had once been. She had fought to be seen, to be chosen. And now, she would fight to stay there, to prove she belonged in this world. But as she stood there, facing the Duke, facing the challenge he had set before her, she knew that the storm was far from over. The tension in the room hadn't lifted. It had only grown more intense. The game had just begun, and neither of them was prepared for what would come next. Dorian turned then, his back to her as he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Sophia stood motionless for a moment, her body still trembling from the encounter, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. The storm was building, and she was in its eye, and as the room seemed to close in around her, she realized that there was no escaping it. She had been chosen, but now, she had to prove she could survive it. The grand hall was unervingly quiet, the heavy curtains drawn to shield the world outside from their intense confrontation. Sophia stood before Dorian, the weight of his gaze pressing into her like a physical force, making it impossible to move or think clearly. The air between them was thick, and for the first time, she could feel the deep, undeniable power shift that had occurred between them in the past moments. Her chest tightened with anxiety, and yet, there was something more, something unfamiliar, something that felt almost like a spark of defiance. She had been thrust into this world, but now she was realizing the cost. The reality of her situation slammed into her as she tried to steady her thoughts. Dorian Reinhardt, Duke of Ashfield, had chosen her, but it wasn't out of kindness. It wasn't a gift. He had chosen her because of something she still didn't fully understand, something dark that hung between them like a heavy shadow. His expectations were clear, but the fear inside her kept whispering that his demands were more than she could handle. "You think you've proven something to me, don't you?" Dorian's voice cut through the silence, low and laced with an edge that made the air feel even colder. He was standing across from her, his tall figure outlined in the dim light, his presence dominating the space. "You haven't proven anything, Sophia." His words made her blood run cold. There was a coldness to his tone, an almost imperceptible cruelty that she had never noticed before. She had expected the power dynamic to shift, expected him to test her, to push her into a place where she had to show him she was more than what he saw. But this was different. This was not about proving herself. This was about survival. I don't understand, she whispered, the words feeling weak even as they left her lips. She wanted to argue, to fight back against the weight of his words, but something in his eyes stopped her. Something in the way he looked at her told her that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Dorian took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. Each step he took was a warning, and every breath she took was a challenge. The distance between them grew smaller, and her heart began to race, her breath catching in her throat. She felt trapped, unable to move as the realization dawned on her. You don't understand because you haven't seen the truth yet, he said, his voice dark, almost dangerous. You think you've earned your place, but you're mistaken. You are a part of this world now, and I control every part of it. His words were like a slap, the sting lingering long after they were spoken. He was telling her that she was nothing more than a tool, something to be used in his game of power and control. She wanted to protest, wanted to scream that she was more than that, but something inside her told her that this was the harsh truth she had been avoiding. She had been chosen, yes, but for what? To play a role in his world, to serve a purpose that wasn't her own, to be controlled? A part of her fought against the thought, but another part, the part that had been crushed under the weight of society's expectations for so long, knew that she had no other choice. She had been chosen, and now she had to play by his rules. As she stood frozen, Dorian moved closer, his hand brushing against her arm as he reached for something behind her. The touch was light, barely more than a breath of contact, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her system. It was a reminder of his power, of his control. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words burned in the silence. Dorian's eyes darkened as he leaned in closer, his lips brushing the top of her ear. "I want you to understand," he said softly. "I want you to understand that everything you thought you knew, about yourself, about your place in this world, is a lie." The moment his words reached her ears, a heavy silence descended between them, broken only by the rapid pounding of her heart. The tension in the room had reached its peak, but it hadn't resolved. Not yet. Not until he had made his next move. He stepped back suddenly, his eyes fixed on her with an unreadable intensity. She stood there, heart racing, barely able to breathe as the realization hit her. The Duke wasn't just manipulating her, he was reshaping her. He was changing everything she had ever known, and she was powerless to stop it. "You will learn your place in this world," he said, his voice steady but full of a finality that left no room for argument. "But you'll do it my way." The words were like a verdict, sealing her fate, and Sophia felt a cold chill creep over her skin. Dorian turned sharply, his coat swirling behind him as he walked away, leaving her standing there, shaken to the core. She was no longer just a pawn in his game. She was the game, and the realization hit her harder than any blow could. She was trapped, but she wasn't broken. Not yet. The power shift was complete, and she knew now that she would have to fight not just for survival, but for her very soul. The storm between them had only just begun. The tension in the room was thick, palpable, like the charged air before a storm. Sophia stood before Dorian, her heart racing in her chest, her body trembling with the weight of everything that had been revealed. Her mind spun with the realization that the truth, the one she had been so desperately avoiding, was now unavoidable. It was like a breath she had been holding for too long, and now, it was impossible to ignore. She had been chosen, but not in the way she had imagined. She had been chosen because she was part of his game, part of a twisted dance that she had never asked to join, but now couldn't escape. Dorian's gaze was unyielding, his eyes never leaving hers as he took a slow step forward. The air between them seemed to crackle. Each move he made a deliberate reminder of his power. "You think you understand," he said, his voice low and smooth, the words slipping through the silence like poison. "But you don't. You have no idea what you're truly a part of." His words landed like a punch to her gut, and for a moment, she felt as though she might crumble under the weight of them. But she didn't. She stood her ground, her chest rising and falling with each breath, each one filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "What am I part of then?" she asked, her voice shaky but firm. "What is this game you've pulled me into?" Dorian's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was cold, calculating. as if he were amused by her naivety. He took another step closer, closing the gap between them. "It's not a game, Sophia," he said softly, his voice like velvet, but with an edge that made her skin crawl. "It's survival. It's control. It's power." His words were a declaration, and they left her breathless. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, her world spinning, the ground beneath her feet slipping away. Dorian's presence was overwhelming, like a storm ready to break. She could feel the weight of his power pressing down on her, making her feel small, insignificant. But she refused to let him see that. She wouldn't show him weakness. "I won't be your pawn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the resolve in it was clear. Dorian didn't flinch. He didn't even move. He simply looked at her with that same cold, calculating gaze, as if he were studying her, deciding if she was worth the effort. And then, without warning, he reached out and gripped her arm. The touch was firm, almost possessive, and it sent a shock of electricity through her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The world seemed to stop in that moment, everything around them fading into nothing. His grip was like iron, and for a brief second, she felt completely trapped, completely at his mercy. But then, just as quickly, Dorian released her, stepping back. The air between them seemed to snap back into place, the tension thick enough to choke on. "You are here because I chose you," he said, his voice low, full of meaning. "But that doesn't mean you get to control this world. You will follow my lead, or you will be left behind." His words hung in the air like a decree, and Sophia felt the weight of them press down on her. He was right. She had no control here. She was at his mercy, and there was nothing she could do to change that. "I won't be controlled," she said, her voice trembling, but strong. She refused to let him break her, refused to let him make her feel small. Dorian's eyes darkened, and for a moment, she saw something in them that she had never seen before. It wasn't anger, but something colder, something more dangerous. "Then prove it," he said, his voice hard, cutting through the air like a knife. "Prove that you are more than just a pawn in my game." The challenge in his words hit her like a wave crashing over her, and for a moment, she felt a flash of something inside her, something fierce, something that wouldn't be controlled. She couldn't let him win. Not now. Not after everything. "I will," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "I will prove it. But not to you. To myself." The words were out before she could stop them, and for a brief moment, she saw something in Dorian's eyes, something almost like approval. It was fleeting, gone before she could even process it, but it was there. "You're beginning to understand," he said, his voice softer now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "But understand this, Sophia. In this world, power doesn't come easily. And if you want to survive, you will have to fight for it." The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. Dorian turned away then, his back to her, but the power between them had shifted again. She could feel it, like a current running through the air, the intensity of it wrapping around her, tightening its grip. She wasn't just a player in his world anymore. She was beginning to understand the rules of the game, and she wasn't going to let him break her. Not without a fight. The storm between them was far from over. But for the first time, she was ready to face it. Dorian was a force to be reckoned with, but so was she. The moment Sophia stepped into the drawing room, the weight of the atmosphere nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. Every eye in the room turned toward her, but none more piercing than Dorian's. He stood by the grand fireplace, his back straight, his expression unreadable. There was a stillness about him now, a quiet before the storm that she had come to dread. The tension between them, the push and pull, had reached its peak, and now, with no more words left to be spoken, it was time to confront the truth. She had been chosen, but what had that really meant? Had it been an honor, or a cruel test? Sophia's heart thudded in her chest as she moved closer to him, each step feeling heavier than the last. She was no longer the girl who had been ignored, pushed aside, waiting for an opportunity to rise. She was no longer a pawn in his game. She had fought to be here, to claim her space in his world. But the cost had been more than she had imagined. Dorian's eyes never left hers as she approached. His silence spoke louder than any words could, and in that silence, Sophia felt the full weight of his power. He had always been in control, always had the upper hand, but now, for the first time, she could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. The room held its breath, as though the very air was waiting for something to snap. Sophia didn't speak at first, just stood there. Her gaze locked with his, the gravity of the moment pressing down on her. She had nothing left to prove to him. This moment wasn't about him. It was about her. She had been tested, had been pushed to her limits, and yet here she was, standing tall. Finally, Dorian spoke, his voice as cold and calculated as always, but there was something in his tone that made Sophia's chest tighten. "You've learned what you needed to," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But learning doesn't change what you are in my world." The words cut through her, a reminder of the power imbalance that had always existed between them. He was still the Duke, still the one in control, but something had shifted. She had shifted. "I'm not the woman you thought I was," Sophia said, her voice strong, despite the trembling beneath her skin. "I'm not a tool to be used in your games." Dorian's gaze softened, just slightly, but it was enough for Sophia to feel the change. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, but instead of retreating, she stood her ground. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. "You're not. But you've proven something to me. Something I didn't expect." His words were a contradiction. He had chosen her because he had seen something in her, but now, he was acknowledging that she had defied his expectations. It was a rare admission, one that spoke volumes more than he realized. The power dynamic was shifting in ways neither of them could have predicted. Sophia's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a strange sense of triumph. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice still steady, though her heart was racing. Dorian didn't answer immediately. He simply watched her, as if studying the way she held herself now. It was as though he were waiting for her to back down, waiting for the fear to return, but it didn't. It wouldn't. "It means you're stronger than I gave you credit for," he said, his words almost a whisper, and for the first time, there was a trace of something different in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or at least recognition. "But strength isn't enough to survive here. You'll need more than that." He wasn't wrong. She wasn't naive. Enough to think strength alone would be enough to survive this world, this game of power and control. But it was a start. It was a foundation she could build on. "I don't need you to think I'm strong," she said, taking a step forward, her voice firm. "I need you to understand that I won't be controlled." Dorian's gaze flickered with something almost like surprise, but then it was gone, replaced with his usual, unreadable expression. "You won't be controlled," he repeated, his voice almost distant. "But you will learn that even when you're not controlled, you will still follow my lead." There was a finality to his words, but this time, Sophia didn't shrink from them. She didn't feel the familiar sting of rejection or the suffocating weight of being dismissed. This was different. She was different. "I will follow my own lead," she said, her voice stronger now, a confidence she hadn't felt before building within her. "But not yours. Not anymore." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Dorian didn't speak, didn't move, but there was a shift, a crack in the unyielding wall he had built between them. He had underestimated her, just as she had underestimated herself. "You are not who I thought you were," he said finally, his voice low and almost resigned. "And that's something I'll have to accept." His words were like a concession, a subtle acknowledgement of the change that had occurred. The shift in power, in control, had happened. Sophia had risen to meet it, to challenge him, and in doing so, she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her autonomy in this world. The room still felt charged, the air still thick with the remnants of their confrontation, but the tension had finally broken. They had reached the turning point. "What now?" Sophia asked, her voice steady as she met his gaze. "Now," Dorian said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of everything that had come before, "we move forward. But remember this, Sophia, everything has changed, and nothing will ever be the same." And for the first time, she believed him. The tension between them was unbearable, a storm of unspoken words hanging in the air. Sophia stood across from Dorian, her body trembling with the weight of everything that had been said and done. The room was still, silent except for the sound of their breathing, each one shallow, as if they both were holding their breath for what was to come. The power shift between them had been swift, undeniable, and now they were both standing at the precipice of something that could either break them or bind them together forever. Sophia's heart raced, her thoughts scattered, but one thing was clear: everything had changed. She had proven herself, but it wasn't just her strength that had won him over. It was the fact that she had stood up to him, had refused to be his pawn. And in doing so, she had claimed a piece of herself that he couldn't take away. Dorian didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, his eyes locked onto hers, studying her, as if he were trying to understand the woman she had become. His usual coldness had softened, but only slightly. The tension was still there, thick and unyielding, but it was different now. It wasn't the same as before, when he had held all the cards. Now, she had a hand in the game too. "You've surprised me," Dorian said finally, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I never expected you to stand up to me the way you have." Sophia didn't speak, but her heart swelled with something, a strange mixture of pride and relief. He had acknowledged it. She wasn't just a woman in his world anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. Dorian took a step closer, his presence once again overwhelming her senses. But this time, she didn't step back. She stood her ground, her eyes never leaving his. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the raw power that always seemed to surround him. But she was no longer afraid. She was no longer the girl who had been invisible. She was someone different now, someone who had fought and won, even if it had been a fight she never expected to have. "You'll never be invisible again," Dorian said, his voice quiet, but with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "You've earned your place in this world." His words weren't a declaration of control. They were an acknowledgement, a recognition of her strength. And for the first time, Sophia felt like she truly belonged. The room was still, the weight of his words hanging between them like a promise, but it was the silence that followed that spoke volumes. No more games. No more manipulation. They were standing on equal ground now, two players in a world where the rules had been rewritten. Sophia could feel the power shift within her, the strength she had built over the past days, weeks, months, finally coming to fruition. She wasn't just in his world anymore. She was in control of her own fate, and she wasn't going to let him take that from her. As the moments stretched on, Sophia felt something stir inside her, a desire to take control, to change the course of her own life. The air between them was thick with anticipation, but it wasn't fear that filled her now. It was certainty. "I'm not your puppet," she said, her voice steady, the words slipping out before she could second-guess them. "And I never will be." Dorian's eyes darkened, but there was no anger in them, only something deeper, something more dangerous. "I never wanted you to be," he said, his voice almost a whisper. The moment hung between them, suspended in time, as if everything had led to this one realization. She was not his to control. She was her own. Sophia took a step forward, her eyes locked on his, her body moving with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't just playing his game anymore. She had created her own rules. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what might come next. The room was still heavy with tension, but it wasn't the same. It was no longer the tension of power and control, but the tension of two equal forces standing together, waiting for the next move. Dorian didn't move as she closed the distance between them, but she could feel his gaze on her, the weight of it pressing into her skin. And when she reached him, when they were standing just inches apart, she could feel the shift in the air once again. It wasn't just the power dynamic that had changed. It was everything. They were standing at the edge of something unknown, something neither of them could predict. But Sophia knew. One thing for certain, she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She wasn't afraid of him.